Hi everybody! In this video, I'm going to be going through the notes for lesson 4.9, which is all about representing numbers that are bigger, smaller, or equal to a given number. The first way we're going to represent those numbers is using what is called inequality notation. Now we're going to go over some rules for inequality notation, then we're going to do some examples. Inequality notation uses special symbols, and you're going to be seeing these symbols a lot. You're going to see a greater than symbol, a less than symbol, a greater than or equal to symbol, and a less than or equal to symbol in order to show whether we want numbers that are bigger or smaller or equal to a given number. When we use inequality notation, the format that we write it in is very important. It's very important to always have your variable be first. Then there's going to be a symbol, one of those four symbols that we just wrote down. And then there's going to be a number. The key here that's very important is that the variable must always be first. So let's look at two examples just to see. For example number 1, we could write this. X is less than 7. And that would be a finalized answer. We've got a variable first, we've got a symbol in the middle, and we've got a number at the end. But sometimes your answers are not going to look so nice. They might look something like this. 8 is less than or equal to X. When that happens, when it's in the wrong order, because we want our variable to be first, we're going to need to know to flip that around in order to get it written the correct way. So the X would be flipped around and go first. The symbol would be flipped around and switch directions, and the number would go on the end. Now that's very important because all of the things we're going to talk about depend on the symbol in the middle. And if your symbol is facing the wrong direction, you're going to get all the answers wrong. So the first step is always going to be to make sure that your variable is first. After that, we're going to be using a graph to show us these numbers. A closed circle means a circle that you actually fill in. It's like a solid circle. And we use a closed circle on our graph whenever we are allowed to be equal to our number. So in other words, when you see a greater than or equal to symbol or a less than or equal to symbol with that little underline, that tells you should be using a closed circle. An open circle, which means a circle that we don't fill in, is whenever we are not equal to our number. So that would be whenever you see a greater than symbol or a less than symbol, where there is no little underline underneath the symbol. After we draw a circle, we're going to be shading our number line. Sometimes we're going to shade to the right. And we're going to do that whenever we want to look for the numbers that are bigger than a certain number. Because on a number line, the numbers that are bigger are to the right. This is going to happen when you have a greater than symbol or when you have a greater than or equal to symbol. Shade to the left is what we're going to do whenever we want to look for numbers that are less than a certain number. So we want to look for numbers that are smaller. Because on a number line, the numbers that are smaller are to the left. So the symbols that we're talking about would be a less than or a less than or equal to. Let's look at a couple examples and then we'll come back and we'll talk about another notation for the same idea. So if you go downwards on your paper, we're going to talk about the four symbols. The first symbol is going to be a less than symbol. A less than symbol is going to look something like this. Now X is going to be first, and let's use the number 2 for our example. Less than also looks like the letter L, just kind of tilted sideways a little bit. So L's look like less thans, and that's how you can remember that this is a less than symbol. What we're going to do in order to make this graph is we're going to put our key number in the middle. And then we're going to label one number bigger and one number smaller. You always have to have 3 numbers labeled on your number line. So one number bigger than 2 would be 3, and one number smaller than 2 would be 1. And again, you must label 3 numbers. Now, based on the symbol, we're going to use an open circle because we do not want to be equal. And we're going to shade to the left because we want to be less than our number. Another example would look like this. We want to look at an example of greater than. So let's put X first, and then our greater than symbol would just be facing the other way. Instead of looking like an L, it's flipped around. And let's use the number 2 again. Again, we're going to put the number 2 in the middle of our number line, and then we're going to label one number bigger and one number smaller. Now again, we're going to use an open circle still because we don't want to be equal to that number, so we're not going to fill in our circle. And then we're going to shade to the right because we want to be bigger than that number. Next, let's talk about a less than or equal to. That means that we are looking for numbers that are less than or also could be equal to a certain number. An example might look like this. X is less than or equal to the number 2. Again, the 2 will go in the middle. We'll label one number bigger and one number smaller. This time, we're going to use a closed filled-in circle because we are allowed to be equal. And then we're going to shade to the left because we're looking for the numbers that are less than that number. Our last example would look like this. X will be first, and we're going to draw a greater than or equal to symbol. That means it's okay to be bigger or equal to our number. So we're going to have greater than or equal to, and let's use the number 2 again. 2 will go in the middle. We're going to look at one number bigger and one number smaller. Closed circle on the 2, and then shade to the right. The only difference, if you look at the less than versus the less than or equal to, the only difference between these 2 graphs is whether we filled in the circle or not. And the only difference between these 2 graphs is whether we filled in the circle or not. So having the little underline just changes whether you fill in the circle or not. The arrow is what tells me what direction to shade in. The first arrow tells me to shade to the left, and the bottom one tells me to shade to the left also. The top one tells me to shade to the right, and then the greater than or equal to tells me to shade to the right. So we're shading in the direction that the arrow points in. Now there is another way to say the same thing. This other option is what's called interval notation. An interval notation uses 2 different numbers, the starting number, which is going to be the lower number, and then a comma, and then the higher number. And then it uses parentheses and brackets. We're going to use a parentheses whenever there would normally be an open circle, because a parentheses means not equal. We're also going to use a parentheses whenever there's an infinity or a negative infinity, because we can never be equal to infinities. We're going to use a bracket whenever there is a closed circle. And that's the only time we use a bracket, because a bracket means we are equal. As an example, there might be like a parentheses here and a bracket here. We're allowed to mix and match parentheses and brackets depending on the numbers that we're looking at. Let's see a couple examples. If we go back to the less than example, a good place to start is looking at the number line. Since this arrow points to the left, it tells me that my graph is going towards negative infinity. So if I look at the shaded part of the graph, the left side, the arrow points towards negative infinity, and the right side where the shading stops is the number 2. Now, my negative infinity, I'm going to have a parentheses because infinities always use a parentheses because you can never actually get there. They go forever. And this time, the 2 is an open circle, so I'm going to use a parentheses. And that's my interval notation. It just sort of matches the order of the graph. In the next problem, the beginning of my shaded part, the left side, is the number 2. And the right side points towards infinity. And there's going to be a comma in the middle. Now the left side where there's a 2 is an open circle. So I'm going to have a parentheses, and the arrow, the infinity, is always going to be a parentheses. Now let's look at less than or equal to. The left side of this graph is pointing towards negative infinity. By the way, infinity was here. Negative infinity. And the shaded part of the graph stops at the number 2. The left side is infinity, so we're going to have a parentheses. And the right side has a closed circle, so we're going to put a bracket by the 2. Last but not least, let's look at the next one, greater than or equal to. The left edge of my shaded section is a 2, and the right edge is an arrow that points towards infinity. Now the left side is a closed circle, so we're going to put a bracket, and the right side is infinity, and infinities always get a parentheses. Let's do a few example problems just to make sure that we've got this. Before you start graphing, always make sure X is first. While you're graphing, always make sure to label at least 3 values. And when you're writing inequalities, make sure you always have an X first and a symbol in the middle and a number at the end. So let's try a few examples. This first problem says P is less than or equal to 2. My key value here is the number 2. So I'm going to label the number 2 in the middle of my number line. And then I'm going to label one value bigger and one value smaller. Now this symbol is a less than or equal to. The little underline here tells me to make it a closed circle because I am allowed to be equal. And the less than tells me I want to shade to the left. Now, if I wanted to write interval notation, I would look at the edges of my shaded section. The left edge is an arrow that points towards negative infinity, and the right edge is this closed circle on the number 2. So I would write negative infinity, comma 2. Then I'm going to put parentheses and brackets. The left side is an infinity, so it always gets a parentheses, and the right side is a 2, which is a filled-in circle, so it gets a bracket. In problem number 2, I can see something is wrong here because the X should be first. So my first move here is going to be to flip this around. The X is going to be first. The symbol is going to flip around, and then the number is going to be last. Now that means that my key number is -4. One number bigger than -4 is -3, and one number smaller is -5. The symbol does not have an underline, so I'm going to have an open circle, and the symbol is pointing towards the right. It's a greater than, so I'm going to have a shade to the right. Now, the left edge of my graph here is an open circle on the -4, and the right edge is pointing towards positive infinity. Because I have an open circle, I'm going to put a parentheses by the -4, and infinities always get a parentheses. Let's try a couple problems where we start with a graph. In this problem, we're starting with a graph and we're going to write the two notations. Whenever we have inequality notation, x is going to be first. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that in. Then we're going to look at the direction of the arrow. The arrow is pointing to the left, so this must be a less than symbol. And the arrow here is pointing to the right, so this must be a greater than symbol. Then we're going to look at the type of circle. An open circle means I don't need an underline. But a closed circle means I am allowed to be equal, so I need to put an underline underneath my symbol. The last thing I'm going to look at is the specific number that is the key number here. It's going to be 2 and 2. Now we can also write this in interval notation. Because this arrow is pointing to the left, this interval is going towards negative infinity, and it stops on the right side at 2. Infinities always have a parentheses, and open circles have a parentheses. For the second problem, a closed circle is on the number 2, and an arrow is pointing towards infinity. My closed circle means I'm going to use a bracket, and my infinity means parentheses. Last but not least, what if we start with an interval? This interval says we're going towards negative infinity, which is this way, and we're stopping at negative 2. So my key number here is going to be negative 2, and I'm going to label one number bigger, negative 1, and one number smaller, negative 3. The bracket tells me to use a closed circle on the negative 2, and then again go towards negative infinity, which is to the left. In inequality notation, my x would be first. I shaded to the left, so it's a less than. And I have a bracket, so a filled in circle, so it's an equal to. And my number here is the negative 2. Last but not least, we have 11 going towards infinity. So I'm going to put an 11 in the middle of my graph, and 12 is one number bigger and 10 is one number smaller. Positive infinity is this way, so we're going to be shading to the right. Because of the bracket here, I'm going to use a closed circle on my 11 and shade to the right. For my inequality, I'm going to have an x, and then shade to the right is greater than or equal to my key number, which is 11. That's it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for learning these symbols, and I'll see you soon for some practice.